Our next BC talker is Brittany Burke. Brittany is a senior in the Lynch School studying elementary education, perspectives on Latin America, and philosophy. Through serving and living in solidarity with people in Chile and Guatemala and completing research in her classes at BC, she was made aware of both the joys and injustices the Indigenous people of Latin America experience. She has been ignited and transformed by the Ignatian ideals of working toward a faith that does justice and hopes to live out these values as she teaches with the Urban Catholic Teachers Corps next year. Please welcome Brittany Burke.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see all of you. As Pat said, thank you for the introduction, Pat. My name is Brittany Burke, and I'm so excited to be here to discuss something that I have been so passionate about studying over the course of my 4 years here. So the title of my talk is ZAP, a poetic reflection on Indigenous politics and identity in Latin America. While the title of my talk might be longer than my talk, I hope to convey this idea that poetry is a really special medium to talk about Indigenous politics specifically. And the reason being, Greg Boyle, who was here very recently, the day he came was like Christmas for me. It's one of the best days of the year. He says in his book, Tattoos on the Heart, that there is no way for us to articulate God. There are no words that we can really put to explain who or what God is, but we can find the moments that rhyme with him. So this will be an attempt to rhyme those moments. So, today in my talk, I hope to answer these questions. What biases do we hold of Indigenous peoples in Latin America? What does Indigenous racial and cultural identity have to do with Indigenous political mobilization? And thirdly, what does this information have to do with our lives as BC students as we work toward a faith that does justice? So to begin to understand these questions, we have to first try to identify how we create biases in the first place. So according to Bernard Larnagan's cognitional theory, the only thing in life we can be positively sure of is the fact that we are the subjects of our own experiencing. Therefore, our ability to interpret data around us and use such data to create abstract, universally applicable definitions is influenced by our own subjective experiencing. For example, if I asked each of you to think of the word cookie and asked you to hold the first image that came into your mind, some of you may have opted for the double-stuffed Oreos that I also chose. Others may have opted for the equally delectable chocolate chip cookie, the bottom. If you're like me, you might have thought of your Aunt Cookie, who was depicted on the right. Naturally, Aunt Cookie is known for her delicious pies. But as you can see, based on our own individual experiencing, our definitions of something as simple as cookie are vastly different. We call to mind what we know in the concrete and apply it to the abstract. We do the same thing with everything we know. If I asked you to think of the word Indigenous, what are the first images or words that come to mind? Do they look something like this? Depicted here are very different looking Indigenous peoples. From the urbanized Lenca in the bottom right to the militant Zapatistas in the upper right, we take what we have seen in the concrete and attempt to make one universal definition. But not all Indigenous people look like the Yanomami of Brazil in the upper left, nor the Guatemalan Indigenous woman in the bottom left. In the case of the cookies, our hope to create one universal definition is not dangerous, and the stakes are not high. But for Indigenous people, ironically, a universal definition of indigeneity, while seemingly allowing these people to unify against the governments that repress them, actually restricts their mobilization and causes them to be further marginalized. Just as there is a great deal of irony behind my aunt's nickname, there also exists a great deal of irony in the Indigenous political situation. Because international governments are made up of people who experience this cognitive phenomenon, they all also had trouble determining who or what constitutes this definition of Indigenous identity, which becomes especially important as they are the ones who choose which Indigenous groups receive their support and funding. So this is the way that Indigenous politics tends to work, and this is called boomerang politics. So state A, which represents the domestic government of the Indigenous groups, so say El Salvador, if we're talking about the Nahuatl people. The Nahuatl people are blocked, as you can see, by state A, so they're weak domestically. However, internationally, they're very strong. So international governments put pressure on state A, so state B putting pressure on state A in order to provide funding and support for the indigenous people. Therefore, the universal definition that these governments created became rooted in a romanticized idea of indigeneity. This idea that indigenous peoples are noble savages, stewards of biodiversity, and spiritual gurus would be used to determine who was indigenous enough to receive support. So state B only gave support to the indigenous groups in state A who met their very rigid qualifications of who constituted indigeneity, of who represented this romantic idea of what it means to be indigenous. For example, in the case of the Nahuatl people in El Salvador, the Matanza massacre of 1932 led to the death of thousands of indigenous Salvadorians. The military targeted those who they perceived to be indigenous based on physical appearance. Therefore, the Nahuatl people changed their image and abandoned many of their traditional customs in attempt at survival. Yet due to this abandonment of many aspects of their culture, which initially made them distinct, the Nahuatl peoples later felt the need to reclaim their indigenous image as perceived by outsiders in order to gain support from international governments so they would seem indigenous enough. So this poem, ZAP, will be used to illuminate their story. This will also be about you and me and dignity. This will be about love, mindfulness, and simplicity. We will find the pulse of a people whose steeples grow further and further out of reach day by day. Unfortunately, we may discuss justice as a future fate. So in this room, on this campus, let us relate in a way that is life-giving and supportive. Let us be down to earth and show each other what we're worth, because I'd like to think that we are more than just a wrapped pile of bones made to mind traffic cones and lines on a road. Our spines bear a heavy load of our unspeakables, unreachables, unteachables, all of which is unpreachable to those who consider themselves to be a wrapped pile of bones. So let us not be confined by this organic contraption, made a slave to biological and synaptic reaction, our skin a phenotypic expression of a cryptic confession from our ancestors past Valentine's days. We are caught in this seemingly benign haze of neutrality, where we tell our children that color doesn't matter. And while well-intentioned, we lather their self-perceptions and our own misconceptions of what it truly means to live equally. So maybe we believe that race is received in a state of passivity, like a gift we are given, don't want, but politely accept. Or maybe race is an activity, an identity we tenaciously pursue and render adept at defining our humanity and combating the calamity that is our society's secret, so well kept. So how do we mediate meaning? How do we stop defeating our own self-worth? Well, she gave me 26 arbitrary squiggles scrabbled on a page which we cage in restrictive clauses for causes cluttered with catastrophe, beguiling in blasphemy and strangling struggles already hard enough to bear, ensnare the downtrodden, rotten fruits we become. As our values, our character, our essence, and their sums are reduced to just a few letters. And that was when my pen looked up at me angrily, and I, perplexed, looked back down at her as she flexed her audacity and next spat back at me. Those arbitrary squiggles you're talking about, those letters, those are my children, and I am a good mother. My children are swaddled in sonnets that mend sore hearts and reared in rhetoric that inspires and invigorates, and my children will wrap you in rhymes rigmarole till the truth be told, to be quiet but won't, sold for a profit but don't make a single cent of it themselves. However, my children can make palaces from slums, hums into ballads, salads into feasts, and my children, get this, my kids, can iron a creased conscience into a newly pressed promise. You are right, though. My children are curses cannoned at innocent ears, but only by adults who validate violence and silence authenticity, wring out passion and squelch eccentricity, not bold enough to dare to reach for felicity. They instead stammer as they perpetuate this insidious toxicity. So I love all my children. They are uppercase, they are lowercase, I would never discriminate. They are loud, they are soft, they are coughed, they are murmured, they are yelled, they are spat, they are expelled, but they are murdered by 2 dexterous hands, 5 digits. A piece of my mind is what you'll get if you try to kill my kids, and that is what she gave me. But she not only taught me the simple little lesson, reminding me that my words are truly a blessing. She opened my mind and opened my heart, and these fists clenched angry from the start, because for once in my life, I am too strong in my convictions to let this three-pronged problem persist. And I will stand for 5,000 people who gave up their identities to make 6 cents a day, 7 days a week, 8 months a year just to starve for the other 4. And what's more is that 9 out of 10 people in this world right now are starving for love. And the other 10th are dying for it. Because somewhere down the line, we told them to get in the back of the line, and for some reason, they listened. For some reason, they believed they were innately worse, while we were innately better, and whether by force or by choice, we silenced their voice, and their stories went unheard. But being socially just is not just about being social. While it requires a certain sense of openness and ability to connect, it is on a deeper level recognition that my story and yours are uniquely distinct and one in the same, but who is to blame for this misunderstanding, and why am I still standing while many others have fallen through the cracks in the sidewalk? All tell their stories. This particular one that I came across in Santiago, Chile, read ZAP. And every day as I walked to the men's shelter that I worked at there, I stepped over it and continually, like we did in the beginning, tried to think what came to mind. What could ZAP possibly mean? How would I define it? How would I take what I knew in the concrete and make it universal, make it abstract, create a definition? And things that came to mind were the Zapatista movement in Mexico. I thought it was maybe shorthand. I thought maybe it was an acronym for an indigenous movement. Maybe it was a protest. Maybe ZAP. Another thing that came to mind was this man that I had met at the shelter there. He told me that while he was in a battle fighting for his rights during the Civil War, he said ZAP, as he painted a picture with his hands. His freckles, wrinkles, and scars became clouds, galaxies, and stars, and he talked of the UFO that came to him while he was fighting a civil war. All of these things were running through my mind as I stepped over the word ZAP. And on the last day that I was in Chile, I realized that the entire time the word said paz. ZAP spelled backwards. But in my kind of Western thought process, I took letters that I looked at quickly and tried to create an English word. But the entire time, it was a Spanish word, paz, peace. Sometimes I realized through this encounter, when we look too quickly, we make mistakes. Sometimes when we look too quickly, we mistake anger for an innate orientation toward hatred rather than a misguided orientation toward peace. Pause. This is the word they chose to leave behind, and peace is the word they chose to say, I am here. Thank you very much.